Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and we're back this time with a new interesting rule set from Howl the Wild. Now, if you're just tuning in for the first time, go check out my other Howl the Wild videos. This book has been insane, filled to the gills with nothing but player options. Some GM stuff, sure, but mostly player options. I'm going to be working for a pretty good amount of time on just this book alone. So if you don't want to miss any of the new stuff, like the many new ancestries or archetypes coming out, go ahead, subscribe to the channel now, and also leave a like so that other people get a chance to discover this content, as more and more people are finding the channel every day, and it is causing us to explode. And that's something I really want to bring to as many people as possible, as all the great things Paizo is going to be releasing. And this is just one book. We got another book coming out in July, August, October, and November. So yeah, it's absolutely insane. Anyway, let's go ahead and get on to the topic of today's video, which is grafting. Grafting is absolutely insane. I absolutely love it. It's really cool because essentially you get to graft onto your character like the effects of a magical item. Sometimes you also get a new appendage or a limb, and I'm a big guy who loves monster stuff specifically, so this is really right up my alley. Some things about grafting first. So in order to graft an object onto a person, the one who is grafting in particular needs to be an expert in medicine, and they need to have the formula, which you can get with the inventor feat at level 7 if you just want to make them up yourself. So this particular skill feat here allows you to graft. When you get this feat, you gain 4 common grafts of 3rd level or lower, and you get a +1 circumstance bonus to medicine checks to implant grafts. And if you become an master in medicine, this increases to +2. Now, you don't technically need graft technician, though there's really no reason not to pick it up, especially because it's just something that's going to be very helpful for applying grafts, and it just gives you a bunch of formulas right out the gate. So that's it. Now, grafts themselves count as essentially necessary invested items. What I mean by that is when you have a graft, it is always going to be invested unless you're at your max invested slots when you get a new graft. So that being the case, you need to make sure that you have room in your invested slots. But I mean, who am I kidding, right? This is Pathfinder 2nd edition. You can have 10 invested items, more if you have a higher charisma, and even more if you decide to play something like a thaumaturge. So I think everyone is still looking to fill out all their invested slots. I know me and my players, we always are just like, well, I might as well just get this ring because I have an invested slot and I might as well fill it with something, right? Grafts are the perfect way to slot in extra abilities to your character, and a very easy item pick in my opinion. And the great thing about grafts, they can't really be stolen or attacked directly. Now, you can, like, if you have a graft on your arm and your arm gets cut off, then it's the same thing as a limb. So it's something where you can technically lose grafts if you get, maimed or something. But other than that, you can't really lose grafts. So that being the case, they make a very solid item choice that really can never be taken from your character, which I think increases their value even more. So let's go ahead and take a look at the grafts they have here in this book, and hopefully some of these might stand out to y'all. Or if you like doing third party or homebrew stuff, give you an idea on new things that you can add to the game as well. So starting off, we're going to take a look at Alluring Lantern. This is a pretty fun one. It's a level 8 item, and what it does is essentially you implant like an angler fish's little bauble on your head, which can be hidden. It mentions it can be laid flat and blends in with your hair or skin. This is one of the more subtle grafts. And once per day for a singular action, you let out your lore, and until the beginning of your next turn, any creature that begins its turn within 20 feet of you must succeed a DC 23 will save or become fascinated by the lore and must spend at least one of its actions to move towards you. This fascination ends at the end of that creature's turn. Something about this, and this is kind of just a very common problem in Pathfinder 2nd edition, is item DCs. At level 8, a DC 23 is really not that high, but I mean, it works on any enemy. It has a big area of effect, and it just works until the beginning of your next turn. So I'll take the slightly lower DC, but what if you level up? Like, what if you get to like level 15? A DC 23 becomes nothing to creatures at that level. So, as an optional rule that I give to my players at my table, you might want to consider bumping item DCs up to the class DC, only the class DC, not spell DC, of the character in question. This keeps a lot of magic items more or less relevant, and for an effect like this, it's not really the most powerful and it wouldn't really break it, but it's something to keep in mind that grafting, while is really cool, some items like this one specifically with a DC that just never changes will quickly become something that you're just going to want to lop off your head, which is not too fun. So I like Alluring Lantern. I think it's really good. It's just, one of the common problems with magic items in the game, it's just their DCs just don't go up. But being able to have a essentially area fascinate is incredibly powerful. So Alluring Lantern is pretty good. Next up, we have a Bioluminescent Stripes, and this one is just a very solid one. You just become a living torch. You can activate it for a single action. You glow a 20-foot bright light and a 20-foot dim light, though you do suffer an item penalty while this light is active to your stealth checks and to hide and sneak. But you can always dismiss this as a free action. I really like this one. It just makes it easier for so many situations where if you don't have an Everlight crystal or a torch or something, this just works better. Plus, you can dismiss it as a free action, which is a little bit easier than stowing or dropping like a torch, which will still be lit on the ground. So I actually do really like this one, and it's a really simple one, and it's a level 1 item. So definitely one I would consider picking up if you have a grafter, and it's like, why not? It's 10 gold pieces. Next up, we have Bristling Spines. Now, this one is very interesting because specifically, it states here that you have needle-like hairs that you can flick into an enemy's eyes, but the damage is very much not indicative of that. Like, the level 1 version of this particular one does a D8 damage. That's like the damage of a battle axe. That's insane. That's not, oh, my eye, you got hair in my eye. No, these are weapons you're using against people. So the fact that they get in people's eyes is really silly. Now, I understand that it's based on the critical effect. If the enemy critically fails the save, they become dazzled until the end of their next turn. I get that. I just found the damage really funny for the implication that you're shooting needles into people's eyes. It's just, it just didn't match up, which I just thought was funny. But yeah, so what does this do? So essentially, once per day, you can flick your spines in a 15-foot cone, making the enemy make a reflex save based on the level of the spines. And on a crit failure, the creature is dazzled until the end of their next turn. Now, this one is not as egregious, though. It does, again, after the max level, get a little bit, kind of pointless. But at level 1, a DC 15 is actually not that bad. So a DC 15 for a D8 damage, pretty good. At level 3, it goes up to 18, which makes a lot of sense, and it's 2d8 damage. And at level 7, it's a DC 23, which I will add is the same DC as the Alluring Lantern, which is a level 8 item. So honestly, a slightly better DC, and it does 5d8 damage. And instead of being dazzled on a critical failure, they're blinded until the beginning of their next turn, which is pretty good. I really like Bristling Spines, though same thing as many other items. After the item, like the max item level, the DC is just going to start becoming less and less relevant. So that's something that, using my optional rule, will stay pretty relevant in your game. Next up, we actually have an uncommon graft here called Camouflaging chromatophores. And this one's actually really, really cool. So essentially, your skin can change color to match your background. And what it does is it gives you a bonus to stealth checks to sneak and hide. And once per day, well, it actually gets bumped up to once per hour at the max level. But once per day for a minute, you can hide without needing concealment to do so, What this does is it makes you hidden to an enemy, though if you want to sneak, which could make you undetected, you will still need to end in cover or concealment, as this kind of gives you the wavy kind of invisibility that you would see like in the early Halo games. So that being the case, it's really good. Actually, just the ability to become suddenly hidden in the middle of a battlefield is really good, because then the enemy will either need to use a seek action to make you concealed, or I guess revealed. I don't know, because you don't actually become invisible. So I guess they could observe you by spending an action, but they have to spend an action to do so. Or they can just swing at you at a DC 11 flat check, which is not too good for them. So very solid, really good, very good for our Minotaurs in this book. If you haven't checked out the Minotaur video, I recommend going and check it out. This particular graft would make Minotaur even scarier, which is absolutely amazing. And you can pick this up as early as level 4, which is really good. Plus, the level 4 gives you a +1 item bonus to your sneak and hide checks, which is really good. And at level 9, it increases to a +2, and you can use this extra ability once per hour, which I think is super worth it. So Camouflaging chromatophore is really good, and even better at level 9 when you can pick up the next level of it. Next up, we have Compound Eyes. Now, Compound Eyes is not particularly one I like all too much in particular. Once per day, when you attempt a flat check on a target, you can roll twice and take the better result. It's okay. It counts as a fortune effect, which is very strange, because it's not actually like being lucky or fortunate. You just have better eyes than most. But most checks that give you like advantage or disadvantage on a check give you the fortune effect. So regardless, it's okay. This is only relevant if you're constantly dealing with enemies who are either concealed or hidden, which would be very annoying in a campaign in general. And I mean, like, it's a level 4 item and it's only 75 gold pieces. So not a bad one to have just in case if you just don't have all your invested items filled. And honestly, filling out all your invested items usually is not something you can really do much very well until the late game. So Compound Eyes is definitely something that I would recommend just picking up if you have the ability to do so, until you have a better use for that invested slot, which, you probably would use it for a very long time. And you always have this ability to be better at a flat check for perceiving creatures. So it's not too bad. And it does state specifically, I should say, a creature that's concealed from you, not hidden. So invisibility typically won't work unless you've already seeked to make them just concealed to you. So another kind of knock against it, but like I said, you might as well have it if it's available to you. Next up is a very weird one, Distracting Carapace. I don't like how this one is written, to be honest. So this, what it does is when you aid an ally, so when you aid an ally who is attempting to create a diversion, instead of using the usual effects of aid, you can roll an acrobatics or a performance check and use that result to determine the outcome of the diversion, instead of attempting a deception check. So this is about aiding. Aiding typically just confers a circumstance bonus to a check. What I feel like this is supposed to do is you can use performance and you can determine your allies create a diversion, which could be good. I don't know. This one's written very weird. I don't know. It says to determine the outcome of the diversion rather than the outcome of the aid. So, yeah. Also, this is just not a maneuver I see people use just very often. Create diversion is just a really good way to off guard an enemy at range for range attacks specifically. So, I mean, and you're aiding, so that means you need to set up an action and then do a reaction. I don't know. Distracting Carapace, it just doesn't seem good. It sounds like it would be pretty. Like you would be a very beautiful character with maybe like a iridescent like carapace or something, but I don't know. I would pass on Distracting Carapace, honestly. Unless one of you down in the comments, let me know how this is actually good. I'm struggling to find the real benefit in this one. Though, in complete contrast to the last one, Echo Receptors is insanely good. Now, this is an uncommon graft, and it's a level 10 item, and it's a pricey 950 gold pieces, but you get a precise echolocation of 40 feet. That's really good. Now, if this was an imprecise sense, I would still think this would be a good item because imprecise senses are really solid. But a precise sense means even if your character is blind, as long as an enemy is making noise, you can perceive them perfectly as long as they're within 40 feet. That means even if the enemy is invisible, you can perceive them perfectly as long as they're making noise, which is insane. Now, it's again only within 40 feet, but that's still really, really good. So, echo receptors, if you have access to it, if you gain access to this uncommon one, there's absolutely no reason not to take this one unless you absolutely need every single one of your invested slots. This one is just only good. Next up is Gills. It gives you the ability to breathe underwater. It's a level 8 item and gives you 450 gold pieces, but it gives you the ability to just breathe underwater, which is insanely useful depending on the type of campaign you're in. So if you have any reason to suspect that you're going to go underwater at all, or if you just have a free invested slot, you might as well take it. It's 450 gold pieces, which is a little bit on the spendy side, but if you're capable of doing so, Gills is just good. It's just good unless you're, again, unless you have every invested slot already used in something else. There's just nothing bad about it. Next up, we have gliding membranes. Now, this one's a very interesting one in the fact that it just makes a feat like Catfall insanely good, or just can be a replacement for Catfall if you're not doing acrobatics. Though, you're going to want a little bit of acrobatics with this one, so let's go ahead and read it. So, first of all, at the base level, level 3, which is only 50 gold pieces, which is pretty good, you treat falls as 25 feet shorter, and even if you take damage from the fall, you can land on your feet as long as you succeed a DC 15 acrobatics check, which is really not that difficult to do at level 3. So overall, your falls are 25 feet shorter, and even if you take fall damage, you can just land on your feet. This is insanely helpful in a lot of ways, and the level 7 version, though it is 340 gold pieces, which is a bit of expensive, you treat falls 50 feet shorter, which there's just not many situations your character is just going to jump off anything like greater than 50 feet. So that being the case, like it would almost completely replace Catfall unless you're doing something like jumping off of skyscrapers, which is somewhat hard to do in a setting like this. So I think that the gliding membrane is really solid and it's just good. Like many of the graphs, as I've said many times, if you have the spot for it, you might as well just do it. You might as well just take it because so many of these are really, really just generally handy. They are good in a lot of situations, or even for the more niche ones, like everyone typically has some open invested slots for quite a bit of time. So it's like at level 3, gliding membranes is pretty good. You might want to swap it out later, and that's completely fine. But just like if you got the space for it, there's no reason not to. Next up, we have Piercing Horn. This gives you a D8 horn attack at level 3, but at level 7, the horn attack gains Forceful and Shove. Honestly, there's no real reason to take Piercing Horn at an early level unless it's like thematic for your character, because you can just get a weapon that does a D8 and probably has some other traits that just make it more worthwhile. And like, even if it's a situation where it's like, well, I have two things in my other hands, so I want a free unarmed attack in addition to that, like, why would you use this rather than one of the weapons you're currently wielding? You know, the level 7 version, though, I will say is a lot more worth it because it has Forceful and Shove. Just the Shove trait alone can make this really good for bully builds, but the Forceful trait can be really solid for a follow-up attack if you're not using like agile weapons. So Piercing Horn is solid, though I would probably only take it at the level 7. Sharpened Canines is even less good than the horn at base. So the level 3 version gives you a D6 piercing attack with nothing else. So there's no like if it's horn or canines, take horn, I guess. But the level 3, there's no point. Like horn is 2 gold more expensive, and it just does like a damage more on average, which I think is worth it for honestly 2 gold pieces. Now the level 7 version, now things change because now the jaw attack ups to a D8, and whenever you score a critical with your jaws, the enemy takes a persistent bleed damage per weapon damage die, which is pretty solid. This one, the level 7 again, is just better, and I would only take it at the level 7. And you could take those with horn if you really wanted to give yourself even more options. But the jaw is pretty solid if you don't have any other like major weapons that you're using, or you just are like a fighter who wants to be able to impose bleed on enemies a little bit more easy, but even then there's like the wounding rune or whatever. So it's okay. It's okay. If you're not using something that can have the wounding rune, then Sharpened Canines is really good to allow you to get a chance to add persistent bleed to an enemy. And the damage isn't bad, but it's like this or a weapon, it's very specific, so take it if it fits your character style specifically. Next up, we have Slashing Claws. This one is it's a D4, but it is agile and finesse. This is really, really good for a lot of different classes that need agile/finesse weapons. And you can spam this one. Like, having a Slashing Claw is really good if you have like a one-handed weapon you're using, or even not, because you can put them on your feet. So you attack with a weapon, and then this just gives your next attack a higher increase if you're not using an agile weapon. It's like use hammer and then use Slashing Claw for a higher chance of damage, even though the damage cap is less. So even at base level, this is probably the best base level weapon I can see, just because it just gives you a slightly better secondary attack accuracy wise. And at level 7, you can actually get Deadly D8, which is really good and not that bad. And it ups the damage to a D6. So of the weapons we've found so far, the natural weapons, I find the Slashing Claw to be just the better one, because I feel like it mixes into a lot of classes a little bit better. But, each of these do offer some unique things and probably can suit certain kinds of builds. So don't take me saying this as a never get the horn or the jaws. Slashing Claws is good in general, but the other two can be good for specific types of builds. Next up, we have Spry Sinews. This is actually a really good one. The first base level at level 3 increases your leap distance by 5 feet and increases your vertical distance by 3 feet. That vertical distance of 3 feet is actually really, really good. And at level 11, though pretty pricey at 11 or 1,300 gold pieces, it increases your leap distance by 10 and your vertical distance by 6. Spry Sinews is honestly really good. Leaping is very underrated because it can get you over difficult terrain, which is one of the biggest uses for it, or over gaps. It's a really good mobility thing. So Spry Sinews, like many of the graphs, if you got the room, you might as well take it. And this pairs perfectly with like Boots of Bounding or the many feats that can also increase your leap distance, making this just a very good graft, honestly. Next up, we have Squid Ink Sac. This is an okay one, honestly. This one still suffers from the same problem of many of them, which is just the DC eventually becomes so low that's not worth having. So, But the Activate Spray Ink once per day ability is pretty good. It's a 10-foot cone that, based on a reflex saving throw, can either negate invisibility if the enemy succeeds, it still negates invisibility for 2 rounds unless they spend 2 actions to wipe the ink off. So making it really, really good against invisible enemies just at base. But if they fail, they're blinded for a round and its invisibility is negated for a minute, which, that's good for sure. But 2 rounds is honestly enough for invisibility. But the blind is solid. Blind for a round is very, very good. And on crit failure, they're blinded for 10 minutes. And its invisibility is negated for 10 minutes. So it's really good. And if you're underwater, you can actually spray this in a 10-foot emanation, creating a cloud underwater that conceals creatures into and out of the cloud. So Squid Ink Sac is pretty good. You need a way to bump that DC, but honestly, I would take this one. This one I think does feel really good, especially, since we have the optional roll that we use. But being able to just blind someone on just a failure is very powerful. Next up, we have Swooping Wings. It's easy. It's a level 17 item. It's 15,000 gold pieces, but completely worth it because it gives you a 25-foot fly speed, which is really cool. And, that actually really makes me think. This picture here with Amiri, the iconic barbarian with the wings, means that she's probably level 17 in this image, which it's always weird to think about the iconics having a level, and they don't ever really look that impressive typically. So I never really think of them as being something as high as level like 17. But, just food for thought. Regardless, Swooping Wings itself is very good. Next up, we have Toxic Blood. And honestly, I think this one is a little bit better than I initially gave it credit for. So essentially what happens is you give yourself Toxic Blood, where if a creature attacks you with a jaw or fang strike or any kind of mouth part hits you and deals damage, they need to make a DC 26 fort save. And DC 26 is not too bad, actually. As a level 9 item, that's actually pretty good. Now, if they hit you and they succeed the save, they're still sickened 1, which is super nasty. So even if they just succeed, just the success effect alone makes this item so good for like the next several levels. Till like level 13, you're gonna get a creature sickened a lot. And honestly, there's a lot of enemies with a jaw strike of some form or kind. And sickened is a really good condition to drop on enemies. So, that being the case, Toxic Blood is probably one of the best grafts in the game. And that's just on success. I haven't even talked about the failure or crit failure. On failure, they get 2d6 poison damage, which is okay, but the sickened is really good. And the crit failure, it's 4d6 poison damage. All this just from being bitten. It's good. It's so passive and easy to use, and many enemies, like I said, use jaw attacks. Like, is it going to be perfect for everything? No, but it's going to be perfect for a lot of things, and making something sickened is just an insanely powerful effect. Now, obviously, again, at high-end game, unless you can increase the DC somehow, it doesn't really carry through. But up until, like I said, like 13, it's a very solid graft. Next up, we have the tube worm gland. This one is interesting, but I think only really useful in some niche campaigns, though it can be useful in some situations. Essentially, what happens is you get a +2 item bonus to fort saves against anything ingested, disease, or poison-wise. So it allows your character to eat or drink like bad or rotted foods or bad water without dying necessarily, which is really good. And I don't like, other than that though, ingested diseases and poisons are just not something that happens like in a combat scenario. So this is not really a good combat one. It's meant for like a survival situation when food and water is kind of limited. So this one is good if you're in a campaign where this is relevant. If it's not, then honestly, this is just an easy pass, but still, I like the fact that it's an option nonetheless. Next up, we have Venom Glands. Actually, just another attack graft, though this one gives you a range attack, though it's a range increment of 10 feet, which isn't a lot, and it only does a d4 poison damage. But if you ever do manage to critical with this one, it also makes the enemy sickened 1. So, as a ranged unarmed attack, there's some uses for this one. I think it's good, and also the chance to sicken an enemy on a crit strike is really good. Not the best weapon, but I can definitely see the use of this one, and if you're playing more of like a support style character anyway, there's no reason not to just attack using this, even though you want to do as much damage. The chance of the crit sickened is going to help your team out a lot. So Venom Glands gets a big thumbs up from me. And finally, the final graft we have here, still going to be a shorter video, even though this has been like a 30-minute recording for me, is the Whiptail. The Whiptail is very interesting, and I do have a little bit of a gripe with it, but I do think it's good. So you gain a tail unarmed attack that does a d6 bludgeoning damage with no additional traits other than the brawling group weapon group. Now this tail though does give you a +1 item bonus to acrobatics checks to balance and to athletics checks to climb. You can also grab an edge even if your hands are otherwise full. This prevents you from needing to grab an edge at the cost of dropping a weapon essentially into like an abyss or whatever, which is a pretty solid effect. And if you pick up the level 7 version, it gets even better as your tail allows you to grapple even though you don't have a free hand, and it gives you a +2 item bonus to athletics checks to grapple. Now, this is the part where I'm conflicted. I wish the tail just gave you the grapple trait on the tail attack. I mean, like, this is technically better for the level because you might not have a +2, like, hand wrap so mighty blows at this level anyway. Plus, technically, if you have a hand wrap of mighty blows, you're going to be investing in 2 items to make this one attack better, which is kind of really lame. But if you ever get to a major striking, then the tail kind of just loses effectiveness compared to another grapple weapon. Though I will say that, most characters aren't using grapple weapons anyway. So just having the ability to get a +2 item bonus to athletics to grapple is not too bad. So the tail is pretty good. The bonus to balance is not something I see happening a lot in the climb. It can be useful, but most climbing is mostly done outside of combat. The grab of edge thing is really good, and like I said, even just being able to grapple an enemy without a hand free makes the tail very good for a lot of builds. You want to be a heavy juggernaut 2-handed weapon wielder, but you also want to be able to make an enemy off guard and like unable to leave you. Like guardians will really love the whip tail because then you can be a 2-handed guardian to go out, do whatever, and still be able to just grapple an enemy, keeping them on you and them needing to get through your probably massive athletics to get out. Makes whiptail really good for a variety of builds. But yeah, that's gonna be it for the the graphs. The graphs are really cool. Just extra abilities you can throw on your character. Many of them being a pretty early level. Like many of these being so good early game make some very solid choices compared to many magic items. And so getting a medicine person to craft on parts of monsters onto your characters is cool. Plus, this is so thematic and story like capable. As a massive creature you finally knock down and you can be like, dang, that was a hard fight. Let's graft some of its parts onto us. Is very thematic. The individual parts then have more flavor, can have more context and lore behind them. I just think that this particular rule set is very cool, and I'm always excited to see players getting new options to augment how they handle certain combat situations. And magic items are just rough to go through. Like these graphs is just a very simple thing that you can go through, get a lot of good abilities of without combing through the literal hundreds. Like I think last I saw 560 different like held items, not including worn items, like thousands of items you could possibly have that can augment your characters. I like the fact that this exists, and hopefully you all do too. But yeah, that's going to be it. We'll be covering the awakened animals tomorrow. So, like I said earlier, if you haven't already subscribed, I recommend doing so because we got a really cool ancestry to cover tomorrow. And as well, the day after, we'll be looking at the wild mimicry archetype, which is going to be a really, really cool archetype. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And have fun with the new graphs and cool items in this book. Bye.